Sorry everyone, I'm just great. Hello, thank you very much. My name's Olivia Hyde. I'm Professor of Practice here at the University of Sydney in Architecture and also the Director of Design Excellence at the New South Wales Government Architects Office. And it's my great pleasure to welcome all of you here to the beautiful Chow Chak Wing Museum here on the grounds of Sydney University, and also to welcome all of those who are joining us online. I do just want to do a little plug before we start for the museum. It is a really beautiful building, recently opened. It has the historic collections of the university, and just to say it's open 7 days a week and it's free, so come on down. I'd like to start, as we must always start, by acknowledging that we meet on Aboriginal land. Sydney University is constructed on the land of the Gadigal, the grass tree people. Gadi meaning grass tree and Gal meaning people. Coming to the talk today, I entered the campus from City Road and passed a group of recently planted Gadi trees, or Gadi. It's a small gesture, but it's a really important one. A start towards the acknowledgement in the design of our built environment that we are on country. A start towards the reconciliation we must all work towards. And we are surrounded by Aboriginal culture here. Parramatta Road is an ancient Aboriginal road. Victoria Park, an ancient meeting place for different groups. It is no coincidence that a university took up this location. I'd like to welcome all Aboriginal people joining us today and pay my respects to those who have cared and continue to care for country. So this is session 4 of the Rothwell Chair Symposium, Living in the City. The Rothwell Chair was established following a major gift from alumni Gary and Susan Rothwell, with the purpose to develop through architecture and urbanism innovation the capacity to create environments which improve people's quality of life. And it's great that they are joining us here today in the audience. Anne Lacaton and Jean-Philippe Vassal are the inaugural Rothwell Chairs, and this symposium is the launch of their 3-year program of involvement. It's a fantastic initiative and a real honour to be here today. In this session, we will be looking into some of the economic planning and policy questions faced by architectural and urban design teams involved in local affordable housing projects. And obviously this is an area that is of particular interest and importance to us working at the Government Architects Office, where we seek to champion good design within government. At this point, I do need to let you know that we have had a change in program today. Unfortunately, 2 of our speakers, Matthew Bennett and Future Method, which is Joel Sherwood-Spring and Genevieve Murray, are no longer able to attend, and I know this is as disappointing for them as it is for us. Future Method have provided a short presentation that they have asked me to read out on their behalf. But we are, of course, very lucky to still have 2 highly accomplished and expert speakers in Nicole Gurrin and Peter John Cantrell. Peter John Cantrell is an urban designer and currently the Urban Design Program Manager in Strategic Planning and Urban Design at the City of Sydney. Peter John worked in private practice for over 25 years in a range of roles, including as a director at Zahns Associates before he started at the City. And he sees himself as having undertaken 3 substantial projects, urban design projects in his life. And I think it's really interesting to kind of reflect on that in terms of the length of time these projects actually take. The projects are the Gungahlin Town Centre in Canberra, Central Park, and now Waterloo. Peter John has taught at every major architecture school in Australia and has won state, national and international awards in architecture, planning and landscape architecture. He is also co-author with Philip Thallis of the fabulous book, Public Sydney, Drawing the City, a collective work involving the contributions of hundreds of students and over 100 practitioners. Peter John will be taking us through the City of Sydney's alternate approach to the remaking of the Waterloo estate. And the change in program has allowed for a more detailed presentation of this work, which is definitely an upside. And just to note that Peter John will be talking as himself, not on behalf of the City. Nicole Gurrin is an urban planner and policy analyst whose research focuses on comparative urban planning systems and approaches to housing and ecological sustainability. Nicole is Professor of Urban and Regional Planning here at the University of Sydney and Director of the Henry Halloran Trust. She has led and collaborated on a series of research projects on aspects of urban policy, housing, sustainability and planning, all funded by the ARC, Australian Research Council, or AHURI, Australian Urban and Housing Research Institute, as well as state and local government. Her recent research has included AHURI inquiries on affordable housing supply. Nicole will be giving us a short overview of the critical economic policy and planning context of social and affordable housing here in New South Wales. And it's admirable that you are able to do that in a short way, Nicole. Future Method Studio comprises Wiradjuri interdisciplinary artist Joel Sherwood-Spring and white settler Genevieve Zoe Murray. Future Method works collaboratively on projects that sit outside established notions of contemporary art and architecture, attempting to transfigure spatial dynamics of power through discourse, political activism, pedagogies, art, design and architectural practice. The studio is focused on examining the contested narratives of Australia's urban culture and Indigenous history in the face of ongoing colonisation. And clearly this issue of Indigenous history and colonisation is of particular importance in any conversation about housing, especially social housing, with Aboriginal people forming a major group of those housed in this type. Future Method have recently been involved in the Waterloo project, and they will talk to this and other ideas. Following the presentations, we'll move to discussion, and I encourage you to participate. We will have a roving mic in the room. And please, if you are online, enter your questions into chat, and Kate Goodwin will be kindly and expertly collating these for our guests to respond to. Thank you, Kate. So, Living in the City, Exemplary, Social and Affordable Housing Design is the title of this symposium. I think the emerging subtitle is How Do We Want to Live? On Tuesday night, Anne and Jean-Philippe presented to us an architecture of both affordability and pleasure, simplicity and generosity. And they spoke of the idea of building with extreme precision, extreme delicacy, extreme kindness. I was struck by two aspects of their talk. Firstly, that their approach of profound care to place, be it a rural or a city site, had such strong resonance with the ideas of designing with country that we are beginning to grapple with here in Australia. The house in the pine forest, where not one tree was removed or damaged, was a beautiful example of this. But the Bordeaux Grand Park social housing project clearly brought this same rigour, exactitude and care to this very different context. The second idea is one to do with effort. For all of us involved in designing, planning and delivering the built environment here in Australia, the road to quality can seem very difficult at times, and the sky far bluer in other climes. There are very real challenges we face here, but the presentations on Tuesday and yesterday helped remind me that all places and all projects face challenge. The Bordeaux project by Lacaton Vassal as a commission was clearly the result of many, many years of research and involvement and dedication. Realising the project a result of intense focus and work far beyond the remit of traditional architectural services. Projects like this that change the way we think and work are always hard. The fantastic projects presented in session 2, all alternatives to standard housing and delivery models, exhibit this same ground-changing quality and the effort that goes with it. For us at the Government Architect, these projects are powerful examples of the value and potential of design. So it is in this context of care and effort that I'd like to pass first to Peter John Cantrell to talk about Waterloo. And when you finish, Peter, I'll get Nicole to come straight up, and then I'll wrap up with the talk from Future Method. Thank you.
Excuse me. So thank you very much for that kind introduction, and I too would like to pay my respect to the Gadigal people, the Eora Nation, on whose land we are today and on whose land I live and work, and most particularly because this project is on the land of the Gadigal and that land had never been ceded, but also because Redfern and Waterloo are the home of the highest concentration of urban Aboriginal life in Australia in the last few decades, and continues to be today. So Waterloo is a place where people from many, many nations all over Australia have come to and found home and found a social welcoming life. And it's a home of political movement, of struggle for Aboriginal people. So in a way, the work we're presenting today needs to have at its heart the benefits that could be for those people. I'd also like to say that I'm speaking on my own behalf today, not as the City of Sydney, and any opinions I express are not the City of Sydney's opinions, they are my own. But I'd also like to thank everyone at the City of Sydney who's worked with me on this project, in particular my director, Graham Yarn, my colleagues at Strategic Planning and Urban Design, particularly Ken Baird, who's worked alongside me for some time and worked diligently and very hard, but also the Council of the City of Sydney, the Central Sydney Planning Committee, the various expert panels of the city whose advice I've taken and sought, particularly the Design Advisory Panel, but also the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Advisory Panel, and also several expert panels that I've made who've advised us on this work. And those expert panels are to do with design, but also to do with the problem of implementing affordable and social housing in the city today. Also, I've had many consultants work with me, in particular the architects Mako and also Tim Williams, as well as in economic consultants, socials consultants and so forth, and also staff at the City of Sydney who work day in and day out in Waterloo and have helped me connect with the people of Waterloo. So this work is an effort, our best effort, for the people of Waterloo. And even though it's our best effort, I also acknowledge that it's probably not good enough. And that's the problem of contemporary society, of not being able to do good enough for those people. So I'll start just going a little bit back in history. Of course, all projects are situated both spatially but also temporally. And perhaps the chief move in recent history was in 1973 when the state government resumed land and made a new social housing project in Waterloo. And that resumption was hard fought. It was the result of the government taking people's homes and demolishing them. They did that by not allowing new work on homes, so homes fell into disrepair. And there were great social movements around as a reaction to this move by government. It included the green bans and so forth. And the Waterloo housing that we see today was eventually opened by the Queen of England, who came out and generously opened this project. In 2010, the state government had a project which they called the Built Environment Plan number 2, led by the Government Architect's Office. And this is an illustration from the city's response to that plan in 2011. And you can see that that plan, and particularly the city's response in that plan, the intention was to maintain and keep the major housing towers and slab blocks that were built in the 1970s, and then to redevelop carefully at a low, medium scale the rest of the estate. In 2014, the state government appointed or made a new agency, Urban Growth New South Wales, and their work revived interest in the redevelopment of Waterloo. And you can see in the bottom right-hand corner of the main illustration, the subject area that we're talking about today. And their vision had, I think it was 9 towers of around 30 stories, and then medium-rise buildings of around 8 stories in between those. Their work led to the placement of a metro station at Waterloo, and the choice that the state government made in placing the metro station at Waterloo was between the University of Sydney, where we are today, who desperately need a metro station, and Waterloo, who also desperately needed a metro station. From the state government's point of view, that would allow the redevelopment of housing that was falling into disrepair and needed rejuvenating. Of course, the part of the reason, but not the sole reason, of the disrepair of the housing and its bad condition was the lack of spending on maintenance of that housing. So Urban Growth put together 3 alternatives which they presented to the community of Waterloo, and these are the alternatives. They all had approximately 6,500 to 7,000 dwellings on a very small site, and then quite extensive consultation was conducted with the community of Waterloo to decide how to move forward. That consultation had limits placed around them. The main limit is that the density could not be questioned. It was only how you could achieve this density in the best possible way. And of course, that density for the City of Sydney was unprecedented and quite extraordinary. This slide shows in orange, Waterloo, with about 6,800 dwellings proposed on a gross area of around 19 hectares. And you can see in the light blue other areas in the centre of metropolitan Sydney, which have about the same number of dwellings, and you can see the size that the same number of dwellings in these other areas occupy. And so it was an extraordinary concentration of development that was being proposed. Should note that several of these areas are the top 10 densest areas on SA2 level in the statistical surveys that Australia does in Australia. So in fact, 8, at this time, 2016, 8 of the 10 densest areas in Australia are illustrated here. And you can also look at it another way. On this size site, how many dwellings are normally accommodated. And so this shows the other aspect of the density, remembering that density is an abstraction because it's a quotient, and it's very difficult to understand a quotient where you have the area and the number, and then you get a kind of derivative figure of that. So we're illustrating the density here in terms of equivalent areas of the same number of dwellings, and then equivalent areas, how many dwellings they accommodate. This gives you some context on the difficulty of the task that was faced. And so this was the preferred master plan that the Land and Housing Corporation released in January 2019 for the 19 hectare site, with around 6,800 dwellings, expressed mathematically as 360 dwellings per hectare, just for reference for those who are interested in that, and included 17 towers of up to 40 stories in height and the complete demolition of all the housing on this site, and also the potential resumption of George Street. And these are illustrations that the city drew to give some three-dimensional understanding of the proposal, because the proposal that came from Land and Housing Corporation was not accompanied by full three-dimensional drawings. And then the city also quickly analysed what was in this project. The first thing that the city realised was that the majority of the open space or parkland was actually made by the closing of a street owned and managed by the City of Sydney, George Street, which has the major bicycle route from Green Square Town Centre, a new development area that the city's been producing over the last decade of around 60,000 people, to the City of Sydney. It passes along George Street, north-south. It's a vital link. That bike path would have to be rerouted as part of this plan. And then the open space that resulted had very little midwinter sunlight. And the city has a kind of rule of thumb, which is derived by expert understanding, where parks, to operate well, the grass in parks needs around about 4 hours of sun every day of the year to take the kind of activity that parks take. And what this illustrates is the white is where that amount of sunlight was available. The brown is where it's not available, which in the city's view was inadequate. And also the city's view was, and our understanding was, particularly from our officers who spend time with the people at Waterloo, but also from the proclamation of the people of Waterloo themselves, is that this was a genuine community that liked living at Waterloo and enjoyed their life there and felt some security in their occupation. The city could not see why high-density towers built only in the 1970s should be demolished. So the community made this very clear. And so this is just a very short film clip which discusses a work of art that was a community-derived work of art. Oops, sorry. How do I... For me.
It's not a legal issue, it's really a moral issue. Not can we do this, but should we do this? Is this the right thing to do with public land?
Sorry about this.
It's not a legal issue, it's really a moral issue. Not can we do this, but should we do this? Is this the right thing to do with public land?
We're going to be going into the buildings and talking to people one-on-one about putting lights just on the windows. An LED coloured light of their choosing, reflecting how they feel towards the redevelopment.
And perhaps symbolise the kind of colourful lives that have gone on within that building.
The Battle of Waterloo is about people, not buildings.
Art is always a weapon.
We need to show the human side of what the redevelopment means for a lot of people.
To show the world.
Yes,
Waterloo. And one of the things I want to see from the LED light is maybe just the pulse of the place, regardless of all that they've tried to do to kill that pulse. It's still there.
Thank you. So, our Lord Mayor and some representatives of the community of Waterloo and our councillors came to us in strategic planning and urban design and said, what would you do here? And also, what is actually happening here? Can you tell us? And we had to reply, Lord Mayor, we can't do anything. We don't have the planning power here. The planning power rests with the state government. So we're unable. But she said to us again, what would you do here? And we said, of course, we would go and sit with the community and form a plan like we do elsewhere in our community. And we're unable to do that because Land and Housing Corporation have done very extensive consultation with the community. And the community, we can't give false promise to the community by pretending that we can do some planning here. But the Lord Mayor insisted. She said to us, you have to show me what you would do. I need to know, and I need to see some context for this. So very quickly, we put together an alternative approach for the city, for this site. And then this illustrates side by side, on your left as you're looking at it, the city's approach, and then on the right, the preferred master plan that Land and Housing Corporation had put forward. And these are just some illustrations of the city's preferred master plan. The main move was really to make, for the number of people living here, a very large park is needed, a park big enough for all the activities, for all the different people to be at this place. The park is about the same size as neighbouring parks, Redfern Park and Alexandria Park. This shows what the park would be like. And then also to make good streets, that at this high intensity of development, the streets need to be wide, they need to be full of trees, they need to have social activity along them. And that, so this would be the main street, George Street, and then the other streets, the residential areas, also need to be calm, have low traffic speed, to be made for people to be in, and a place that the people in their houses could look out onto. And also because Waterloo is flat in the west of George Street and then steeply sloping to the east, going up to Pitt Street, it needed to be a place where everyone, no matter what your ability, could walk around and go through. So these are just some illustrations of what we proposed in our alternative approach. And then this is looking from Small Laneway. This is at the south end of the park. And of course, we said that at least the 2 point towers and at least 2 of the 4 slabs should be kept. Our ambition was really to keep all of them. And then this is another film clip. Whoops, I don't know what's happened there. This one's without sound. Thank you. And so this gives just some impression of what the place might be like in the city's alternative approach. So here you see the park, and we're looking south over the new park here. And then this is in the main street, George Street, which will be widened to 30 metres wide. And then this is another view from the south end of the park. You see the playgrounds. And then this is a view from the neighbourhood. This is what was proposed by Land and Housing Corporation. This is what we said should occur in terms of its regional context. Again, this is what the Land and Housing Corporation were proposing, and this is what we say would be a better alternative. And again, this is the Land and Housing Corporation proposal at the time, and then this is the city's alternative approach. Now, there are significant differences, but generally the main difference is that we'd reduced the intensity of development. So rather than there be almost 7,000 dwellings, we proposed 5,300 dwellings. That was as dense as we could think that we could make a good place. And that rather than there be 40-storey towers, the buildings were at 5, 9 and 13 stories high generally. That we retained buildings, that we kept more trees, and that there was a more equitable distribution of the building bulk across the site, and that the neighbourhood was made of streets and walkways and was a fine-grained, permeable area. So as a result of a kind of agitation by our political leaders, in 2019, the City and Land and Housing Corporation met to seek alignment between the two proposals. And we were greatly assisted by the guidance of our colleagues in the Department of Planning, Industry, Environment and the Government Architects Office who assisted us to talk together. And in those discussions, we pointed out that more open space was needed, and Land and Housing Corporation agreed. We also pointed out that 40-storey towers could not be built on this land because this land is under the influence of the flight path to the airport, Sydney Airport. And the Sydney Airport, like all airports all over the world, has a sort of plane of operation that allows it to operate safely. And over Waterloo, to keep the airport operating safely, particularly in emergencies, the maximum height you could go to is 30 stories, not the 40 stories that were proposed. And also we pointed out that Land and Housing Corporation couldn't build on our streets that we owned and managed. And it wasn't only George Street that they were wanting to resume from us, they wanted to narrow streets like John Street in order to accommodate the density that they were proposing. They agreed to that. So then, as a result of that, the Minister for Planning and Public Spaces granted, that's a mistake in my slide, excuse me, granted the city the planning authority to make the plan for this place. And in May 2020, Land and Housing Corporation lodged a planning proposal request for Waterloo South. And so the area occupied by the point towers and the slabs was excised, and that would be considered at a later stage. And this area shown in red, which was now the area under consideration. So the request included the improvements made as a result of our conversations. A better park, more sunlight in the park, George Street remaining as a street, the regional bicycle path retained, no development on the city streets, some widening. I think there was one street that was widened from the previous proposal, and the heights to reduce to meet the Sydney Airport requirements. And there was a few other minor changes. But from the city's analysis, there were still too many 30-storey towers, and that the development lots were too large, and they actually prohibited the participation of community housing providers. And the city's ambition was to have more affordable and social housing on this site. That the streets were still too narrow, that the amenity standards were too low, and that streets and walkways were not accessible for people of all abilities. So the city revised its concept. We were made and became aware that if we didn't match the density of the proposal, which had been somewhat reduced, then our planning authority would come to nothing. And so we had to match the same number of dwellings as the request made for LAC in the revision of the planning. We allocated a similar amount of community and other space. We reorganised things by having a more efficient street layout so that there was more land to build on, and that would reduce the intensity of development. And we also continued the idea of making overall a lower scale development, and also we did more economic work, which proved to us that more affordable housing could be afforded at no cost to government. And also we wanted to ensure that there was dedicated First Nations housing in the planning framework as well. So this is just a revision of that earlier slide to give you an idea of the intensity of the task. And this is what we set forward for our own ambition, which was to make better streets and parks that are accessible to everyone, that respond to the changing climate, that are social places, better buildings for a mixed tenure community where every building has good amenity, no matter what the tenure is for that building. And that the building heights were designed for the streets and the parks primarily. So this is illustrations of our new streets, George Street, the main street at the top, and a typical residential street at the bottom. And then this also, we proposed 2 parks, a main park, which would be the centre of community life, which is big enough for all the various activities and all the people who would need to use the park to be able to use it. And then a small park which provides the only thing that the main park couldn't provide. It's a quiet oasis, and it provides a sort of withdrawal that in the main park, which would be busy and active, would not provide. But we also wanted to make sure that every building was a good building. In the proposal that came to us, the towers would have about 2/3 of the population in it. 2/3 of the population would be market housing, and then the low buildings, which occupied about 1/3 of the total number of apartments, they would be occupied, they would have less amenity. And so our idea was to make sure everyone had good amenity. We also wanted to make smaller building lots so that there are many more buildings by many more architects with many more entries onto the streets, so there'd be more variety. And that we carefully placed the height in relation to the streets and the parks. So then this just summarises now the planning proposal, which is what the city is proposing on your right-hand side, and on left the request that came to us from Land and Housing Corporation. And so the first thing we said is that the streets need to actually revive other streets that had been resumed and taken away by their predecessors in the 1970s. So John Street and Mead Street and Pitt Street were revived, but also that the streets should be wider and they should run sort of north-south in the cardinal points to get more light into them, to be better streets. And that the streets should be accessible. And so this illustration shows in the in the yellow colours, where streets are not accessible to people of all abilities, and the darker yellow is new streets that are made. So we said that the streets should be laid out along the topography so they're accessible, and that special pathways and ramps and so forth should be made up the slope. We also said that the shops and community services should be on the ground and on the street. The proposal that came from LAC was a kind of shopping centre with underground shopping and above ground services, and then other smaller things scattered all over the site. We said you should make a main street and that it becomes the social heart of the place. And then the building heights, in order to get the intensity that was the number of dwellings that Land and Housing Corporation had proposed, we had 3 towers widely spaced in the south so that they wouldn't interfere with the sunlight to the other residents, including the residents further south here, and that the medium-rise development would be higher where there's better amenity on the wider main street and the parks, and then lower along the other streets. And then this just resulted, by comparison, more sunlight in the streets. And then this is a sectional view of the streets. You can, at the large scale in the section on the top right as you're looking at it, the central one shows the main street, George Street. The orange colour is where there's not enough light for trees to grow well. So for trees to grow well in the streets, they need around about 2 hours of sunlight every day of the year. And orange is where there's less than 2 hours of sunlight in the middle of winter. So we said all the streets should be filled with more light. And the parks should be filled with more light. There was an improvement in the Land and Housing Corporation request. We have a standard where at least half of the parks need that, and they just passed that. The small park that they proposed was just 50%, and you had to count little bits of sunlight here and there. We said it needs to be more than 50%. And also one result of towers is that they produce uncomfortable and sometimes unsafe winds at ground level. Now, this is a statistical measure of how fast the wind is moving at certain times of the year and so forth, but it was unacceptable to us that at a planning proposal stage there should be 4 points, which are the ones shown in red and orange, where it would be unsafe, according to the wind engineers, on the streets. And then this just illustrates cross-section of both the request and what we were proposing. And then these are just some views from the local area, from Redfern Park of the request and the proposal, across Alexandria Park of the request and the proposal, across the new park looking south of the request and the proposal, along George Street of the request and the proposal, and closer up, request and the proposal. And so then there's another movie. And then this shows the revised approach by the city. This is coming up one of the minor streets towards the park here. And then we'll fade into the park looking south, back towards where we were coming from. And you can see the towers that are now added. This is the main street, George Street, with the taller medium-rise buildings. From Redfern Park, the request made by Land and Housing Corporation and what we were proposing. And then the park with illustrations of the request from Land and Housing Corporation and what we're proposing. Remember that in all these comparisons, it's the same number of dwellings we're looking at in the same area of the site. This is the Land and Housing Corporation request, and then it'll fade into what we're proposing. So, the same number of dwellings, a much higher amount of affordable housing, and that the affordable housing in our economic analysis could be financed without the state government making any contribution, and that there be housing dedicated for First Nations people. Now, it's not possible for us to put this into statutory instruments because of the legislative framework that we put together, but in our design guide, we're saying that at least 10% of the affordable housing should be dedicated to First Nations people, that the proportion of First Nations people living on the site should remain the same, and with the increase, that would be an increased amount of housing for First Nations people. And also we've embedded Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people into the design process, both as practitioners, but also as people involved in the making the juries, the making of briefs and so forth. We also embedded higher and more certain sustainability standards. And where we are today is that the Minister for Planning and Public Space has taken the planning authority away from us again, made himself the planning authority. This is to address the doggedly uncooperative stance of Land and Housing Corporation towards us, and appointed an independent advisory panel who would advise the Department of Planning, Infrastructure and Environment, and the department will now take the city's place in the planning process. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Peter John. You've left it at a real moment of suspense. I'm Nicole Gurran, and thank you for the warm introduction earlier, Olivia. And thank you very much for the invitation to speak at this very important symposium. Before I begin, let me also acknowledge the traditional Gadigal owners of the land on which we meet today and on which I live and work. And let me pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and particularly those who've fought tirelessly for their lands and communities in the Redfern, Waterloo area, and who continue to do so. On that note, I also acknowledge the very important work done by community-based teams like Future Methods, who unfortunately weren't able to speak today, but who are going to come to us via an address after my own. And of course, I also acknowledge the city's efforts to lead a planning process for Redfern Waterloo, which is both community oriented, but also, it must be said, politically, which means economically feasible. And let me just note, for the sake of transparency, that I have served on one of the city's many advisory boards in relation to Redfern Waterloo, alongside Nathan Moran, the Chief of the Metropolitan Aboriginal Land Council, and I also acknowledge their tireless advocacy and advice in relation to Redfern Waterloo as well. Given that, I'm now not going to talk much more about Redfern Waterloo in my own comments, though I am going to start there. But I want to take us to a wider conversation about the structural factors which really explain where we are today and why, in my view, we are so far away from the socially informed architecture and politics that have been presented by the chairs of this symposium, Lacaton and Vassal. So to start with Redfern Waterloo, way before I became an academic, I was a baby planner, and my very first job was actually working with tenants, and one of my first site visits, if you like, was a community meeting in Redfern Waterloo in one of the towers, which had actually just been refurbished, and bed sits, we're like mid-90s, I think it was 1996, bed sits had been amalgamated to form one-bedroom units, the sole objective being to provide a better quality of life for the residents who were, prior to that intervention, were unable to have visitors in their rooms, because essentially how can you socialise if you're confined to a bedroom? And I was really reminded of that moment in my own career and in our own housing history in Australia when I saw the work of Lacaton and Vassal, even though of course it was on a much larger scale than that intervention in the mid-90s in Redfern Waterloo. Nowadays, of course, in Sydney, the goal of redeveloping social housing isn't fundamentally about increasing space and dignity for residents or communities, but it's about, and we have to say it, we have to put this on the table, it is about maximising the real estate value of the site, even if this is partly to do something that I would absolutely endorse, and I'm going to say that we need to do, is increase the desperately needed supply of social housing. And of course, despite the city's heroic efforts on that matter as well. So despite the absolute vertical rise of housing wealth in Australia, it seems that we can't afford decent housing for our poor. This is a political choice. It is not a complicated economic puzzle or an impossible social problem. I'm probably preaching to the converted here, but I'm going to preach a little. So how did we arrive at this place where the idea of preserving social housing or public housing towers and improving them yes, on the public purse, has become radical politics. So I'm going to take you on a very, very short historical tour, and again, for many of you this will be familiar, but I think it's important to ground us in the events that have brought us here. So I didn't know it in the 90s, but they were actually a real turning point in Australian housing policy. At that time, so when I started my housing career, about 10% of all new homes were being built as public housing. Now, it didn't remain in the sector. But today we are at 1%, which is less than replacement level. We had widespread effort in Australia towards a national housing strategy, long abandoned. And in New South Wales we had a green paper which proposed all sorts of new non-market housing options, things like housing cooperatives, foregrounding choice for social housing tenants, non-marketised forms of ownership, and of course the establishment of the New South Wales Aboriginal Housing Office. But things were also changing. We'd already started to see in Australia social housing as a form of social welfare, not of housing actually. And welfare which needed to be rationalised, given only or made only accessible to the poorest of the poor, rather than open to a much wider group of people, including people with full-time jobs who were able to pay higher rents and did so, cross-subsidising the provision of social housing for people on lower incomes. So in Australia we had embraced neoliberalism, like the rest of the world, of course, which meant that we thought that markets could solve housing problems. And we've been chasing those market solutions ever since that time. So the Commonwealth and the states wound back their funding for social housing. As I said, now about 1% of new homes are public housing. And instead we focused on the private rental sector. We hoped that that would pick up the slack, especially if private landlords were incentivised via negative gearing. And we all know negative gearing provides a tax incentive for property investors. So property investors began to win big because of low interest rates, of course, and financial deregulation. Again, that was a global trend, of course. But this made borrowing very cheap, very easy, as well as in Australia having that special bonus of being a tax deduction as long as it was for housing. We saw social housing estates as places of concentrated disadvantage, as though the people, not the policy settings, were the problem. And the solution was renewal, nice word, and social mix, which has actually come to mean real estate redevelopment. Now, the private rental sector did grow, partly because first home buyers were priced out of the market by investors. And so we saw first home buyers, of course, become middle class renters who also aren't often able to access decent rental housing. Because we've done very little to help those renters in the private rental sector, unlike European countries and even most of the United States, Australia's renters have very few protections from rent increases or protection from eviction, and the income subsidy that's paid to low-income renters, highly targeted again, very hard to qualify for, but even that very targeted intervention leaves almost half of those recipients still in rental stress, paying more than 30% of their income on housing. In Sydney, nearly 70% of our low-income renters pay more than 30% of their income on housing. Now, of course, in New South Wales, we've flirted with things like inclusionary zoning, which requires a proportion of all new housing and new developments to be made affordable to people on low and moderate incomes. We've got a state planning policy called affordable rental housing, under which there's a grab bag of policies, one of which includes providing granny flats in the backyard and soon allowing Airbnb-style rentals as well. And none of these things are actually inherently problematic in and of themselves, in my own view. But in the absence of a properly funded social housing sector, as a social net, in the absence of proper income support for the very poor, and of course rental protections, if we're going to continue to rely on the private rental market for our low-income groups, we are just playing around at the edges. So can we reverse this? Can we change the politics of housing policy in Australia? I hope so, and I've made it my entire research career actually to try and contribute to that cause. But we've got to confront some really deep challenges, and the first of those, of course, is foundational. And this is not unique to Australia, but I think it's different, for instance, to the context that Lacaton and Vassal are practising in, and that is our assumptions about land, property and real estate, which of course date from colonisation. Making wealth from private land and from housing development has underpinned our professions in architecture and planning since colonisation. And of course, if we're honest, it also explains the relative patterns of wealth and inequality that many of us in Australia continue to benefit from. And of course, we see those differential patterns in Australian society. And so that does help explain the politics of property in Australia, stemming from this foundational investment in housing as the source of our own personal financial wealth and security, which then over the past 40 years in Australia, and then of course in the rest of the world, has grown exponentially into a financialised asset class. So when housing researchers talk about the financialisation of housing, that's what they're talking about, housing becoming a financialised asset class that's far removed from the value of homes as places to live. However much we want to recalibrate homes as places to live and as the foundation of communities, instead we've become locked into a politics of preserving the status quo, protecting and boosting the financial value of housing assets to protect our existing property owners at the expense of low and moderate income renters. And of course, the most recent example of this, out of an abundance of examples, is the government's home builder grants to home renovators and builders, rather than, for instance, investing in social housing. Now, thirdly, of course, our wider economy in Australia particularly is addicted to property wealth. The employment in the construction sector is a really important part of our economy. State stamp duties, of course, consumer confidence, they all depend on a stable and probably buoyant housing market. We've got to confront this economic importance of housing because it helps us explain the distorted political power of real estate lobbying groups, for instance, when it comes to resisting very sensible changes to our economic policy and our housing policy in Australia, such as changes to negative gearing. So the political approach has been to misdiagnose housing problems as a consequence of shortage brought about by regulation. So we hear calls to liberate housing development, to increase supply. That's the answer. To be brought about by, for instance, abandoning attempts to preserve rural lands, or by winding back our protections, our attempts to prevent sprawling car-dependent development and socially isolated suburbs, and even to wind back residential amenity in apartment buildings. All of these calls actually to wind back regulation in the mission of kickstarting housing supply have been made even in the last week. They've been in our newspapers even in the last week, rather than the obvious and sensible call to redirect public funding towards new and enhanced social housing. So it is of course possible to redirect resources towards new construction in social housing. And this is not going to, I mean, the beauty of having a non-market sector of the housing system is that actually it doesn't affect the value of real estate at all. And in fact, it's extremely protective for macroeconomic stability because it allows us to have a construction sector that is able to power on irrespective of the peaks and troughs of the real estate cycle, producing houses to meet population growth and change and need rather than changes in house prices. There's a multitude of funded proposals on the table from housing advocates. At the moment, a very modest proposal for just 10,000 new social housing dwellings per year. Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute, or HURI Research, has shown how the government can use cheap loans to aggregating low-cost finance for non-profit housing developers. In fact, that scheme is up. All they lack is capital subsidy to get projects off the ground. Of course, if we redirected negative gearing just towards requiring affordable long-term leases, even just for lower income earners, that would radically improve life for renters. Better still, to target that tax resource towards generating new quality homes or renovations where we need to cater to growth and change. Now, of course, states could support renters and drive quality in the rental sector by introducing rental protections and standards as called for by housing advocates like Shelter Australia and the tenants' unions. And research undertaken during the COVID period showed actually that increased support for lower income earners allowed people to improve their housing conditions as well as their security. And we should just be demanding that the Commonwealth extend those rental subsidies so that in future lower income earners can afford and can demand better quality homes. Now, in this symposium, we've heard some fantastic models actually of non-market forms of housing provision, and those should absolutely be on the table as well. Forms of non-profit ownership, such as was demonstrated by the Assemble model yesterday, models of deliberative housing development for those who don't need subsidies. So these are catering to people on moderate or even higher incomes. They don't need subsidy to afford their housing, but they are looking for a non-marketised form of housing development and access. I'm also thinking of the community land trust models, which also provide alternatives to ownership but allow people to have decent and secure housing. And of course, the international cooperative movement, which is at the forefront actually of housing development in Holland and has long been part of the landscape in Germany. I know that's been on the table here in this symposium, and there's clearly a real appetite for that type of change in Australia as well. But, and so, of course, this is a symposium that has primarily been about design, even if the only takeaway I'm going to offer you is that design, unfortunately, isn't the solution to our housing problems in Australia. Not even bringing about lower cost forms of construction. While we've got a market-dominated approach to housing provision in Australia, those with the most means on that market are always going to be the ones who benefit from our design innovation. The problem is not also with the social and affordable, the problem even within social and affordable housing, I should say, in Australia is also not one of poor design. In fact, some of the best design is occurring in that sector. But the problem is the limited parameters in which this work takes place, the terms of the briefs that, for instance, force the city to respond to a yield maximising rather than a community optimising scheme that positions current residents and their homes as the problem rather than the starting point. rather than the working with what is there and the extreme delicacy as described by Lacaton and Vassal and exhibited in their work. So I think in closing that the conversations and the work done by the design community, and of course led in this symposium by Lacaton and Vassal, serve as a very powerful critique, a radical alternative to the state of housing policy and practice in Australia, but also as a defence of modernist ideas that not only spawned a particular form of architecture and design, but which also believed very firmly in the progressive power and the obligation of the state to intervene in the market to deliver very important social goods like public housing. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Peter, John and Nicole. And I'll just move on to reading the piece that has been sent to us by Future Method. So just to be clear, I'm reading Future Method's piece out and they're unable to be here to present it. Are you hearing me okay? Yeah. So we would like to acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded, always was, always will be Aboriginal land. We would also like to acknowledge and warn any Indigenous members of the audience or those watching that we will be speaking of those who have passed. We are sorry not to be with you today. We were invited to talk to you about the Future Planning Centre, a small independent community-run space we founded with the Waterloo Public Housing Action Group in 2016. It was, with Jenny Munro as co-chair, a space that sought to formalise resistance to the redevelopment of the Waterloo housing estate in a spatial sense, and to centre Indigenous people and their voices in the master planning process. The Future Planning Centre was designed to break the choreographed loop of consultative frameworks that ordinarily characterise community consultation and engagement processes. It was a space that brought community together with planners, academics, politicians and councillors. It was a space not controlled and orchestrated by government, but one that gave unpreferential advice to tenants, a space for them to voice their needs and their concerns. We had a tea urn set up with an endless supply of Monte Carlo biscuits, comfy couches, an open library, information for tenants to keep them informed about meetings, relocations and changes to the process. We had a big model of the neighbourhood made slowly by the residents as they visited, one that included their memories and stories about their neighbourhood. We ran information sessions, futuring workshops and talks. It was a vibrant little space that went some way to shifting the power balances at play in these processes. But we cannot talk about money in this neighbourhood without remembering TJ Hickey, the 17-year-old Aboriginal boy who died on the Waterloo housing estate at the hands of police on February 15th, 2004, and I'm sure all of us remember that. We cannot talk about memory in this neighbourhood without remembering Patrick Fisher, the 31-year-old father who died in 2018 in the same place under the same conditions. Sorry, I've just skipped. Today we would like to speak to the conditions we practice within here, which, as Anne Lacaton drew our attention to in her opening address on Tuesday, are critically important to us as architects. There are obvious differences in the conditions between the settler colonial nation state we are in here and that of Europe that we would like to highlight, and we hope that a spirit of reciprocity, of two-way learning is undertaken in this 3-year conversation between Lacaton and Vassal and Sydney Warang that this symposium is launching. At the time we were invited to take part in these talks, people were gathering all over the country to protest to stop black deaths in custody. At least 474 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people have died in police custody and prison since the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody handed down its final report in 1991. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people make up 28% of the prison population in Australia as of 30th of June 2019, while making up just over 3% of our total population. The Australian Bureau of Statistics for the same period said that Aboriginal people were jailed 13 times in the rate of non-Indigenous people. A discussion about policy must start from the struggles of the most marginal intersections, because those struggles are where the worst and most compounded of hostile material conditions occur. Following TJ Hickey's death, the Redfern community took to the streets in protest. The Redfern riots, as they became known, were seized upon by politicians and media to entrench racist stereotyping of a violent drug and welfare-dependent Aboriginal community. Not coincidentally, on February 17, 2004, then Premier Bob Carr announced his intentions for the urban renewal of Redfern Waterloo and the establishment of the Redfern Waterloo Authority to oversee this process. The relationship between policing and policy, planning policy in particular, is what we would like to speak to briefly here. The history of this dynamic, the interdependentness and co-constitution of planning policy and policing, is foundational to the formation of architecture as a discipline and is foundational to the making of the settler colonial state. We don't have time to expand on this now, but we must as a discipline begin to grapple with it, with the reality that the policing of public space, who is allowed to use it and for what purpose, has been instrumental in the dispossession of land, with planning policy acting as the scaffold this process sits upon. The settler colonial city as we live in it today is literally made by the physical act of planning it, building it, restoring the landscape with memorials and Western placemaking practices. It is through placemaking, through city-making processes that empires take place, and it is the policing of that space that still to this day makes this possible. The public nuisance laws targeted at antisocial behaviour, introduced at the same time as the Redfern Waterloo Authority was established, have worked together to make the urban renewal of this neighbourhood possible. I think of the umbilical connection between forms of carceralism and Indigenous life, both historically and today. The shift from welfare carceralism, stations and rations, to protectionist carceralism, the mission and stolen generations, to penal carceralism, laws that target Indigenous people and prisons, attempting to structure where and how we can exist. So the record and increasing number of incarcerated Aboriginal people is connected very specifically to the way space and place are managed by the dual structures of policy, planning policy and policing. The word itself, polis, for which policy and policing have their origin, from which translate from the Greek as city or state. Essential to any system, to any structural system, for example the law, the planning system, is that it is constituted by what sits outside of it. To explain this in the Australian context, innovation in planning policy has been determined by resistance to it. Torrens land title is a legal instrument designed to erase the history of land tenure and to reinforce the contested notion of terra nullius in land title instruments. Native title, whilst a product of the High Court determination of the fiction of terra nullius, was simultaneously used to assert the sovereignty of the Crown over these lands. Land right legislation in New South Wales, a long fought for means for Aboriginal self-determination, has yet to prove itself as just means of compensation for land theft and has instead operated as a means of containing resistance. It was planning policy that was implemented to remove the Aboriginal tent embassy in Canberra. It was the experience of land rights legislation in the Northern Territory that informed the current restrictive land rights regime in New South Wales. It was planning reform in Redfern that has worked to remove Aboriginal people from their neighbourhood. It is this condition of policy and policing working together that we must understand and address. If we are to have a robust and meaningful conversation about how a framework like Caring for Country might operate with Aboriginal people being central to it, then we have to consider that any planning policy reform or innovation is central and instrumental to the ongoing colonisation of their land. So what capacity or interest do we expect the 57,000 Aboriginal people living in Sydney to have in engaging in this process? We don't just want to be free in the abstract. There are concrete things we want to do to get free. We don't just dream of liberation. Our ideas have to be in contact with the structural reality that oppresses us, so that reality becomes what we hoped for and our hopes become the new reality. The only way to fulfil this transformation is through action. But that action has to be conscious of what exactly we are fighting against and what is the most liberating thing to be fighting for. Radical conscience does not come from nowhere. Some people might try to fight against the wrong thing. Some people might try to fight for the wrong thing. We are speaking to you today with our teachers and leaders, those we are accountable to front and centre in our minds. They are Joel's Wiradjuri family and ancestors and elders. It is the Gadigal community of Auntie Rhonda Dixon and Nadina Dixon, our Gamilaroi and Wiradjuri leaders Lorna Munro and Auntie Jenny Munro, our dear friend Yuin woman Linda Kennedy, the amazing women at Redfern's Bunjagal Women's Council, Auntie Bronwyn Penrith, Auntie Ashley Donahue, GMA's Helen Eason. There is so much beauty in these people and their spirit, thinking and practice that we acknowledge. Lastly, we'd like us all to think about the mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers, cousins, aunties, children's partners of those who have died in police custody. May we make our cities safe for them. Thank you. So again, that was reading from Future Method Joel and Genevieve, who are unable to be here today. So I just get Peter, John and Nicole to jump up on stage. We are actually nearly at time, but we do probably have time for a few questions, which would be fantastic. So thanks. So look, thank you both. I'm sort of keen after those presentations to have a moment to reflect also on what we can do, I guess. And I suppose I was kind of busy scribbling here, but it did strike me that a lot of the examples that we've seen over the last 2 days do involve architects sort of moving outside of the sphere that they normally operate in and perhaps into some of these spaces like financing and so on. And I was just wondering if you could both in your different ways start by reflecting on, you know, what is the space as architects that we can contribute without, you know, starting with the premise that we first have to turn the Queen Mary. And, you know, because we are all here, I think many of us involved in this area and wanting to do the best work that we possibly can. But maybe Peter, John, could I pass to you to start with that one?
Yeah, I can start. So I think the first thing to do is to acknowledge that architecture is a weak practice. And that it's a weak practice because we're at the bequest and behold of our clients, that we act through others. So that's the first thing. The second thing is not to be discouraged by the fact that it's a weak practice, but in fact to take courage from that, because that gives us a point to move from and to expand, and a place to be critical, to question, and to work hard. It also makes us a discipline that can collaborate and that can seek advice from others, but can move that advice into a kind of reality. So that's where I always work. The way that I work is I find the best possible people to work with and work as closely as possible with them. And I found, for example, in this project, I've worked with hundreds of people on this project, and all of them have contributed vastly to the wealth of understanding and the positioning of the project. And to be in that position is like an extraordinary privilege, in a way, to be able to draw together these things. And they're drawn together by the fact that there is a project and there are actors in that project, and that architects can kind of illustrate and help people imagine what future reality is possible or could be possible. So it seems contradictory. We're weak, but actually we can be at the centre. And we're weak, but actually that weakness gives us a position of strength. So that's kind of my answer. It's based on my own experience. It may not be everyone's answer.
Thanks, Peter John. Nicole, have you got any thoughts on that one? And then I'll flick to the
Sure.
audience.
Look, the main, I think, power is, as Peter John says, it's one of demonstrating and imagining and showing an alternative. And I think that's immensely powerful. And then the second thing that I would say that I find very important, just as a practicing planner when I am in practice, is the architects that, whoever their client or whatever context that they're working in, actually do take the kind of place-based, person-based approach to their practice, and they think about the quality of each dwelling, given whatever parameters they're working within, as well as that dwelling or that development's intersection with the community and with the space that it's moving into. So that's not a structural, it's not a changing the world, but it is improving the place and improving the quality of life for residents, which is really important. But that symbolic constructing an alternative, the imaginative power of potential alternative models, I think that is really powerful.
And echo what Nicole says, because always what you're doing in architecture is reforming places for people to dwell in. Like, that's at the basis of our practice. And so the closer you can be to the future inhabitants of your work, the better your work will be. But of course, generally speaking, we don't know those future inhabitants, because works of architecture, I think, good works of architecture last a long time. And they last beyond our lives and beyond the lives of those who are involved in making them now. So what you have to harness, what you need to understand, is the long-term project of the city, of making the city both as physical space, but also as a space that represents the city itself and represents values. And there are choices to be made in values. Are you choosing a city that is open and public and for everyone? Or are you choosing a city that is precious and privileged and for a few, just to put at the extremes? And that's a choice we all need to make every day in every moment of our practice. And I'm saying this without saying, one is better than the other, but I know that every time I sit down at my desk or stand up in front of people or sit down at my computer, that's actually what's happening. I'm making those choices. So despite the inability for architects to make change, real change in society, I think we have a great opportunity to kind of project these things.
Thanks, Peter John. That's great. Look, I'm conscious there's probably questions in the audience. Or do we have any from online? No, silence from online. Very different from Tuesday night when I think there was a rush. A smiley face. That's nice. Any questions from people in the audience today? Yes.
Hi. So my question kind of pertains to an idea that was just raised, the idea of having, that the idea needs to come into contact. So I'm a second year undergraduate student here at the University of Sydney. And in our education studies, I do realise that the majority of our work is based in the hypothetical. But
What was that, sorry?
Like our studio work and whatnot is based in a hypothetical sense.
Right, yeah.
So not actually going to be constructed. But if we, through our education, we do want to become engaged in these kind of very real current issues, is there any mechanisms or whatnot that exist that we can engage in a non-tokenistic way to afford these kind of realities within our designs and things like that? Anything that people who aren't actively out in practice doing to better inform ourselves for when we do end up there?
Good question. Yeah.
So the time you have as a student is your most important time, because that's where you have space to think and to experiment and not to be actually infected by reality. So that is really your most important time. And so as a student, you should be looking at the hypothetical questions put in front of you and strive to bring reality to them. Because I can tell you that when you're in practice, to make the time to think is virtually impossible. I mean, every second of my day is occupied by questions and demands and requirements and so forth. And if I didn't have that time to think early in my life, putting that into a place would be really, really difficult. I'd be overcome, this is too much for me, I can't take it anymore. But because I've had that background, I've had time to think, I find that I thrive in that environment, because it gives me a place to implement those thoughts that I had long ago. So, take time, understand the world before you have to go out and act into it, because you'll find it's so easy to make mistakes when you're in the world. It's kind of easy to go wrong, and it's difficult to find a good path. So it's a precious time, this time as a student, very precious.
Just wondering, did you have anything to add to that, Nicole?
Only that a lot of architecture students who start with that question end up doing planning. not that planning is, is an unproblematic career, and hats off to Future Method for pulling out some of the problems with the planning system. That architects play a really, really important role as architects, not within architecture, throughout the city and in the community sector, as well as, as in industry. So there are a lot of wide contexts in which you could work, and you could certainly start doing that as a student with any of the community-based organisations, for instance, that deal with housing, if housing is one of the things that interests you.
Nicole, you said in the 1990s, I think you said, there was a turning point where we were swamped by neoliberal ideology. And
it started before then.
It started before then, but it sort of really took off here, and we went from 10% low-cost housing to 1%. And Peter, you were saying that I believe that architects do have some power in our own weak way, through the visual image, and kind of which gives us an ability to sort of build utopian worlds and model utopian worlds, which can be very persuasive. I just wondered if you saw at the same period of time that Nicole spoke about a change in the way that architects locally dreamt. Did they sort of give up on utopia? I mean, it's interesting being in Canberra recently. You see, it certainly seems that is the case down there. They had a wonderful sort of utopian moment, and it's just gone, So I just wondered if you had any comments on what happened in the 1990s.
Up to me. So you're asking the wrong person that question, because the utopian project's a failed project, and it's been a failed project from its beginning many centuries ago. So I have I place no store in the utopian project. My only interest is in reality, in real life. That's what I'm interested in. So in another way of answering this is in relation to the political and social and cultural construct of the people that we serve as architects. Obviously, we're tossed about on the waves. So when things change, the way we're tossed about changes. And so the way we can act also has to change in relation to that. So yes, it's noticeable, but actually the neoliberalism is a movement that goes back a long time. And there's ebbs and flows in it. And so I kind of think there's nothing new, actually. I don't find anything new in these things, in these challenges.
I think actually if I could just comment that Matthew Bennett, were he able to attend, was going to present a project which, to your point about sort of real life, would have been a really good illustration, I think, of how we work and can still work really positively in these settings. So anyway, Nicole, to that question.
Oh, look, I just think that's a great question, but it's one probably that everyone in this room would have a position on. We could discuss it for ages. I mean, look, the 90s was what also happened, in that same time when we stopped building public housing, we had our Premier, Bob Carr, offended by the design quality of residential flats, and we had the introduction of the Residential Design Quality State Environmental Planning Policy, otherwise known as SEP 65. And actually, as a, design moment, it was a point in time where there was a commitment to reform regulations to improve the living quality, actually, of apartments. So, again, I think we've had design moving along. Now, did it allow innovative design? I mean, talk about that, cats, cat amongst the pigeons. That's a topic that architects can debate forever. But was it committed to just improving the quality of life for people living in apartments, which was a new thing really for Australians? Yes, it was. But that policy came unaccompanied by any commitment to making sure that decent apartments were affordable or available for low and moderate income earners. And so, so we can just see that parallel. Design can continue and can continue to inspire, but we need to get the economics, and it might be a dirty word, but we need to get the policy right to make sure that even just a decent standard of housing, which to my mind is utopia, Peter John. Utopia is actually a decent standard of secure housing for everyone, and it shouldn't be out of reach. But that's almost independent, actually, of design.
Yeah, yes and no. I mean, everyone really does have the right to live well and to have a home. I think it's a kind of right.
It's not a right in Australia.
No, so it's not a right that's provided for in Australia, or that's even articulated as such in the general sense. But I think it is, and I'm kind of thinking back to last night's presentation, it is a kind of right to have a good home. And too many people don't have a good home. There's just too many people. But relatively speaking, in other places, even more people don't have a good home. And there are other times and other places where we're closer to that and we're further away. So that's why I don't really consider it utopian. I think the challenge is to make it the reality and to always be striving to make that the case. And the other thing is that the sorts of questions in the 90s, they're not unlike the questions at the end of the 19th century, where too many people didn't have affordable housing, where the quality of housing was very poor, where design was made to change so that actually the same things that are being debated today. You know, should every room have a window? Was the big debate in the 1880s in New York, or again, even in the 1920s in Australia. That was a debate. There was a Royal Commission in Victoria about that, had that thing at the end of it. And we're still talking today, you know. There are some jurisdictions in Australia where, it doesn't matter if a bedroom doesn't have a window, is the kind of dominant thing. So I think we just sort of, at every opportunity, we've got to strive to make things better. That's all. But we have to do it in a way that's real. We have to achieve that, not simply think about it.
I must say, in the work that we do, it's always about trying to get things a little bit better, and it's very rarely in the space of utopia. And but I think there's huge value in that. I think incremental change and your point about the role that you can play as a facilitator to many parties coming together who may have very different drivers, be they political or economic, and making that case through sort of illustration and the rest of it of what's possible is super important.
Olivia, can I just make one final observation, and that is that we are often told that we can't afford good design, or that expecting or requiring good design is actually the problem when it comes to housing affordability, almost as though those two things are at odds. And that is just absolutely not the case. Because of the way that the housing market has financialised housing, that's happening irrespective of whether there's a window in the bedroom or not. If that real estate is valuable because of where it is and because of its investment potential, it's going to cost a lot of money. And therefore, I just want to encourage all of the architects and designers at the front line that you're not the problem if you're trying to insist on decent design and decent housing in your work. Anyway, sorry. Off my podium now.
No, that's good. And I mean, I suppose too that in terms of, you know, what is good housing, what is good design, what I see in the work that we're doing and where we sit is that there is a shift, a very clear shift back towards understanding that there is such a thing as good design and that it has value and a place, and also in sort of establishing mechanisms to evaluate that and understand it as not, you know, not the gold taps, but rather really just the minimum that we should be expecting and requiring, and that's really positive, I think.
I agree.
Any last questions? And then I think we're probably at time. Yes.
So I've recently been back to Australia after living away for nearly 2 decades, and what we've noticed as well with my partner is that we would spend our weekends going around the city, and there's so many more big developments by companies like Mirvac in the city and also in the suburbs from the 1990s, and they're quite bland, to be honest, and they all look they look pretty much the same. And you can get in, you know, inner city suburbs like in Waterloo and so on, and Green Square, and you've got these huge blocks of quite identical buildings with, I think, quite minor differentiation. And I was just wondering, how supportive is the state government in pushing for experimentation because in comparison to, say, countries in Holland, where we used to live, even nearly 2 decades ago, you see 60s apartment blocks being redone in terms of the interior layout and the facade. And it's not only, they didn't only experiment in the design, but also in having mixed occupancy of, say, elderlies with student housing combined, and the whole structure of having housing association working together with government, I think really pushed the whole design attitude towards housing. And he was, my partner, he was working on a project where the client wanted to design a building that would last for 100 years. And it was very supported by the government, and it was 3 huge blocks. They worked with Arup to really create the whole amni and structure that would encourage change, because buildings change and the way people live change within decades or a century. And how is the state government here? How supportive are they for experimentations and funding to do so?
I might just make a really quick response, because I know we're at time, but you've just absolutely perfectly articulated the potential role of a non-profit housing sector in the housing system. A non-profit and limited profit role, and that is what explains the difference between what you observe on the streets in Amsterdam and the new developments on the streets in Holland. That is what explains the difference between what innovative design, people-oriented, community-oriented designs have been in Holland versus, the upzoning and real estate-oriented development, say around railway stations, etc., that you will see in Sydney. And it is really just this commitment to, and a history actually, of a social housing sector being a very big part of the housing system. And it's the kind of development outcomes that you can get. There's obviously a design response, but really, to my mind, it just shows the importance of building a social and non-profit housing sector.
Peter John, do you want to talk about some of the things the city has been doing in that space?
No, I think Nicole's answer is the right answer.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, I think in that, yeah.
Okay, thank you for everyone for attending today. Thank you very much to our speakers, Nicole and Peter John, and also to Future Method, Joel and Genevieve, who I hope are listening, perhaps online at least, and to everyone who attended today. So thank you very much.